Hi and welcome on behalf of Helbling to a series of teaching tips videos. I'm Herbert Puchter and with me in the studio is Chris Jory. Chris is an author, an expert in language teaching methodology and an excellent presenter, and it's my great pleasure to introduce him to you and to collaborate with him on these teaching tips videos.
Thank you, Herbert. It's a great pleasure to be working together with you on this.
We're very happy to be able to share with you a range of practical tips and insights in a series of 4 videos.
Yes, and in these videos we'll be looking at how to use songs, how to use video clips, how to help learners to learn to love grammar, and how to help them to learn better and to get better results.
Why are we making these videos available now? Well, a new syllabus will be introduced starting with year 1 in September 23. And we've been working hard for 2 years on creating support that you can count on and which will help you to implement the new syllabus successfully in your teaching.
So we'd like to invite you to watch this series of videos offering a taste of new ideas and new materials.
This session is about 6 things you need to know about helping your students upgrade their learning toolbox. So it's basically about helping them to be more successful in their exam and test preparation. So let's have a look at what we're going to cover in this video. We'll start out by exploring some breakthrough research insights that come from what some people have called the new science of learning. Research carried out in general education, so not in ELT, into how students could learn more efficiently and effectively. One of the outcomes of those studies, and I will be talking about this quite a bit, is the recommendation that learners, rather than studying for tests or exams, should engage in what researchers call retrieval practice. We'll discuss the difference between those two, talk about the reasons why retrieval practice is a lot more efficient, and we'll make practical suggestions as to what we can do in order to implement such a retrieval practice approach in our teaching. And last but not least, we'll talk about a vision for the future of learning and the future of teaching in many ways, that would help students study more efficiently and in a more personalized fashion than this is currently possible using online support systems. As teachers, we tend to care a lot about the efficacy of our students' learning. So it's become a tradition for us to inform our learners well ahead of a test or an exam what it is they're supposed to be studying for it. And that usually includes language, as in vocabulary, phrases and grammar, but often skills work too, reading, listening, speaking and writing. Of course, there are always going to be 1 or 2 students who don't take our recommendations too seriously. As a colleague once said about her adolescent class, they couldn't care less, they are too busy growing up. And then there's the majority of learners who spend a significant amount of time studying. However, as probably many of us have realized, even among the ones who take this task very seriously, not all are successful and may achieve far less than they had expected given the amount of time spent revising. As their teachers, we know that one of the possible reasons for that dilemma is about inefficient study strategies. As I've said, there are these fascinating insights from what's called the new science of learning that clearly show where the problems often lie and how students could make their learning much more efficient and enjoyable. The big problem for us as teachers lies in the practicality. Learners often don't know how to study efficiently, and many colleagues with large classrooms in particular feel there's never enough time for all the things they should and could do. So it would be impossible for them to become a personal learning coach for each and every student in the class. You may be asking yourselves what this photo has got to do with upgrading our students' learning toolbox. Well, the photo reminds me of a fascinating scene I saw quite some time ago in British Columbia, not far from Vancouver, so on the Canadian west coast, where every year millions of salmon swim upstream to find their spawning grounds. It's a difficult and dangerous journey for the fish, with bears, bald eagles and other predators waiting for them. And of course, swimming upstream, swimming against the stream is quite a struggle. Terry Doyle, one of the researchers whose work focuses on what we can do to support our students in adopting more efficient study strategies, using this as a metaphor, and he compares the salmon run with inefficient learning when he says that for us as teachers, it's all about helping students to stop swimming upstream in their learning. Now, this next quotation comes from a fascinating book by Bosch and Watson. It's a pretty recent publication, 2021. The title is The Science of Learning, 99 Studies That Every Teacher Needs to Know. The book gives an overview of the most important research studies on teaching and learning from the last few years. It's about learning in general, not just language learning, but highly relevant, we believe. So here's the author's definition of what the new science of learning is all about. And they say, new insights into how the human brain learns make it clear that many of the learning practices used in the past and that students continue to use are highly inefficient, ineffective, or just plain wrong. And it was as early as 2013 that Doyle and Zakrzajsek, two researchers from the new science of learning, they were one of the first people going in this direction, queried the efficacy of many of the learning strategies used by students. As we will see shortly, what they claim here is actually still pretty relevant. 2013 was a turning point in the educational research, in the research into learning and the efficacy of learning. It saw the publication of a seminal meta-study on learning. You can download this from the web. It's a meta-study, a monograph, I think, of about 80 pages It's titled Improving Students' Learning with Effective Learning Techniques, Promising Directions from Cognitive and Educational Psychology. And in this highly interesting study, the authors reviewed more than 700 or 800, I believe, research papers into 10 commonly used learning strategies. The study refers to learning in all subjects, and for each of the strategies, the researchers carefully examined the scientific literature available to see whether a strategy was of high, moderate, or low utility to students. As time is limited, I'm focusing here only on a few of the strategies, and I've selected them because they are frequently used in language learning. These are, first of all, rereading, sitting at one's desk and reading through the same kind of text or word list, vocabulary list, or lexical set again and again and again, hoping that we will retain it in our long-term memory. That's a strategy that many students use. Underlining would be the next one, and marking, highlighting. And these are both about marking visually, either by underlining or by using one of those pink, yellow, blue, green, what have you, highlighters. Underlining and highlighting those language items that need to be remembered, for example, from a text or again a list of words. And while rereading, highlighting, and underlining are strategies with regard to the methodology of studying, cramming has to do with the distribution of the time spent studying. So rereading, highlighting, underlining have got to do with how students study. Cramming has got to do with how long they study for. So cramming is staying up late the night before an exam, studying for several hours, often in one go, trying to remember as much as possible for next day's exam. I of course, like probably many of you, have used this technique myself, and it can be a very powerful technique, but it's not, as we will see, a very efficient technique when it comes to storing information in the long-term memory. So point number 2, rereading, highlighting, underlining, and cramming have been shown to be highly inefficient. Okay, and let's now look at that in a bit more detail. So what is the problem with rereading? Well, as one of the researchers said, just because they are busy doesn't mean they're learning anything. So it's been shown that students who engage in intensive rereading often do a lot of it, but the amount of language, especially when it comes to having produced later what they have learned through rereading, the amount of language that they actually retain in their long-term memory is often disappointing. So they keep themselves busy, but often rather unsuccessfully. And one of the insights from those recent studies that gets stressed in several papers is that when students reread, for example, they're not engaged deeply enough cognitively. They are busy, but they do not dive deeply enough into their learning while rereading the information they want to remember. It's even possible that students are engaged in rereading. They're reading and rereading and rereading, and while they're doing so, they might even be thinking of something completely different. Small wonder then that it's not the most efficient study strategy. What's the problem with highlighting, or what's the problem with underlining? You'll probably be thinking right now that the slide looks confusing, and I wouldn't argue with that. But that's done on purpose to illustrate the problems that have been found in connection with highlighting and underlining. Danlowski and his colleagues refer to one of the research papers they revised, and they say that, and that's actually the copy on this messy slide, perhaps most concerning are results from a study that suggested that underlining can be detrimental to the later ability to make inferences. It may be problematic to the extent that it prevents students from other more productive strategies. So forgive the messy look of this slide, please, but I hope it gets the message across. Underlining and highlighting do make individual items stick out from their context, but these techniques might actually make it more difficult for students to make connections between ideas. And now, what's the problem with cramming? Because probably many of us have experienced that when we're preparing for an exam and we stay up the night, or maybe even study through the night before an exam, it is possible to actually remember quite a lot of information. The problem is that it's not just that students are tired the morning after they've studied for too long the night before. The problem is that because there are no sleep phases in between, they usually do not remember things in their long-term memory when they study things by or through the means of cramming. So sleep has this very, very important function that is connected to memory. Let's have a look at this quotation by Diane. The book's called How We Learn. It's a 2020 publication. He says that learning is much more efficient when done at regular intervals rather than cramming. We're better off spreading out the learning, so over several days. The reason is simple. Every night our brain consolidates what it has learned during the day. This is one of the most important neuroscience discoveries of the last 30 years. Sleep is not just a period of inactivity, quite the contrary. While we sleep, our brain remains active. It runs a specific algorithm that replays the important events it recorded during the previous day and gradually transfers them into a more efficient compartment. I think this quotation is worth reading out. It really gives very clear reasons why on the long run, and when we consider long-term memory storage, distributed practice is a lot more efficient than cramming. Now let's have a look at the strategies, and this is point 5, at the 2 strategies actually that were found to be highly efficient. So the first one is practice testing. I would have got it wrong, to be very honest. I never thought this was going to be one of the 2 most highly effective and efficient strategies. practice testing, also called self-testing or pre-testing, because it's the kind of test that you can give your students before a real test, so to speak. It can also be carried out in pairs with students testing each other. Then it's often referred to in the literature as buddy testing. So practice testing is one, and the other one is distributed practice. Now, in a similar fashion to what I said previously, when we spoke about rereading, highlighting, and underlining, where I said they've got to do with how students revise, while cramming is about the time they spend revising. In a similar way, practice testing is about the how, and distributed practice has got to do with the time. So it's basically the opposite of cramming. It's about distributing the revision over several days with, and I'd like to stress this again, phases of sleep in between, as discussed previously. Let's have a look here at a few of the findings. First of all, about practice, self and buddy testing. The difference in outcomes when comparing continued testing with continued revision are very significant, as you can see from this quotation from one study. Performance on a final test was substantially greater after continued testing. So self-testing, practice testing, buddy testing, where the results were 80% retainment rather than after continued study. And with study, what the researchers are referring to is rereading, highlighting, underlining, where the retainment level was 36% only. So this is why they stress that testing, self-testing, pair testing, practice testing is so much more important than simply sitting down, studying something by rereading it. Basically, because when our students get engaged in practice tests or in pair tests, in buddy tests, they go more deeply, they are more engaged cognitively speaking. Danlowski and his team also found a number of quotations in these studies, or found some evidence in these studies on dosage. So how much should our students be revising through those practice tests? And they're saying, well, concerning dosage, the simplest conclusion is that more is better. Of course, we have to take it with a pinch of salt, don't we? Because more isn't always possible. So it's again about the practicality of this. There are constraints to what students can do, certainly. They're not robots, after all, and it's often not feasible for a teacher to produce more than one practice test, especially if students need practice tests at different levels in order to cater for the needs of a mixed ability classroom, for example. So here we basically get to the limits of what is practically possible, not only for students, but also for us as their teachers. Another point here, the researchers say that they observed significantly greater final test performance when students engaged in cued recall practice until target items were recalled 4 to 5 times versus only once. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? And it's a crucial point. We're talking students doing the same practice test more than once. So that is actually a key point and an outcome of this research that is totally significant, that practice tests should not just be given once or should not just be done by students once. If they do them more often, if they get repeated once or maybe even twice, even 3 times maybe, they are more efficient. This quotation refers to test modality. And what we can see is that the more deeply students have to think while doing their practice tests, the better. The researchers say that the available evidence suggests that practice tests that require more generative responses, for example, recall or shorter answers in the student's own words, are more effective than practice tests that require less generative responses, tests where students, for example, can use their recognition to answer a specific task. However, we have to stress that this doesn't mean that the test activities that require less generative responses, as Danilowski et al. Say here, are actually useless. They can be important stepping stones, I guess we could say, for students on their way towards improving their performance. When it comes to practicing grammar, for example, there are students for whom form manipulation from the very beginning can actually be too demanding. They will need receptive grammar activities first and should only later be engaged in more demanding activities. Every classroom is a mixed ability classroom. Every classroom is a heterogeneous classroom. So we need to consider this also, that there are students for whom recognition is a very important first stepping stone. The idea is to show students how they can prepare better for exams or tests. We can show them, for example, how they can study words in context much better by going to the word list at the end of a unit. We can tell them to cover up the context sentences and test themselves trying to remember the context sentence for each word, rather than reading and rereading these context sentences. They can also do this in pairs as a buddy testing activity, obviously. If you get them to do this regularly, perhaps in the last few minutes of a series of lessons, they will hopefully notice that they are getting better each time they test themselves or each other. Another idea would be to use a short retrieval practice activity at the beginning of each lesson. If, for example, you want your students to practice a certain grammar structure and you want them to remember it, ask them to think of the text they read in their last lesson and create, say, 3 or 4 sentences related to the content of that text using the structure you want them to practice. Tell them to write those sentences down. That's the think phase. The next is the pair phase. Tell them to talk to a partner and compare their sentences, and also help each other, if that's possible, correct them. And finally, it's about sharing. Ask them to share their sentences with the whole class. And that takes a few minutes, but will get them deeply engaged with the language. If done regularly, students will remember better, but they will also almost subconsciously adopt key learning strategies here, key retrieval strategies. And finally, do some practice tests with them before a test or at the end of a unit. I know that many of you are doing this anyway. The key point for them is that they can see that they're achieving better results each time they do the practice test. So the key point for you is that they're doing the practice test several times and not just once, will help them consolidate the language. We are aware that what we are saying here is actually, especially in the last sentence on this slide, ideally we would use differentiated activities to cater for individual needs. But this is, of course, often hypothetical because, again, it's a question of practicability. Let's use it as a reminder that every class is a mixed ability class and that ideally students should be challenged according to their individual language levels. But we are also aware, and the colleague here is expressing this when she said, but how can I do that regularly and systematically when we have, I don't know, 28, 30 students in a class? They have different language levels. We want to give them more than one practice test. We want them to do the practice test several times. And on top of that, we want the test to reflect the fact that we have mixed ability students in our class. So I wouldn't want, and we wouldn't want to give the impression that we don't agree with the students here. There are limits to what we can do and how much time we have available to prepare those things in a real world. So this is where I would like to share a vision for the future with you. Things would, of course, be a lot more feasible if practice testing and distributed practice were readily available online, wouldn't it? So here's the vision for the future spelled out in a bit more detail. In this learning and retrieval practice cycle, in this type of cycle, we would start with the upper right-hand green box, okay, which is all about our teaching and our students learning practice, and they are, of course, interdependent processes. So teaching and learning that is in line with the objectives specified in the syllabus, the new syllabus that is going to be valid as from next September for year 1. Students then do regular practice tests, let's say at the end of a unit. They get their results. You can see the results. The results are, of course, produced by the digital system. And students are then led according to the outcomes of their tests to activities that are adapted to their learning progress, something that is absolutely impossible for a teacher unless you have 24 hours available 7 days a week. They then take another practice test, get their results, and so on. So it would be a cycle of doing, checking, and acting and reacting. And of course, in such a system, students actually could, and you could recommend to students, repeat practice tests as often as they would want, and they would see how their learning actually improves, how their outcomes get better. Let's have a look at this system and what it would look like in connection with a course book. Students would work through a unit in the course book with you. So that's the teaching and the learning, the green box. At the end of the unit, they would do a practice test. Now, step 3, the orange box. They would see the results. You could, of course, also see the results, of course. Depending on their test results, then, a learning track is suggested to them. So it's a personalized kind of learning track for the students that helps them to revise, possibly on different levels, the areas that they are not very good at yet. If somebody has 100% on Lexis, they don't need to revise Lexis. But if they have problems, then they would be led to a learning track where they can do more practice work there, and a subsequent practice test. So once students have done this individual learning track, they repeat version 1 of the practice test. Inevitably, they will achieve better results, but this is very much in line with the findings from the new science of learning. The more often students are doing the test, the better the outcomes will actually be, as discussed previously. It's a vision for the future, for the time being, but we believe that in order to make practice testing and distributed practice a regular feature in language learning, such a system would be required to assist teachers, us, you, in being able to engage students in regular practice testing with a level of challenge that helps students wherever they are in their individual learning progress. And you can see the sheer amount of time it would take if you were to try and implement such an approach, creating these tests on different levels for your students all the time. So it has to remain a vision for the future, for the time being. We hope you have found this session interesting, and you will be able to at least recommend to your students practice testing and distributed practice in their exam and test preparation. You can see a write-up of the 6 things that are useful if and when we want to help our students upgrade their learning toolbox. Number 1, many of the learning practices used by students are highly ineffective, especially underlining, highlighting, and rereading. That's number 2. As far as the methodology of study strategies is concerned, as far as the timing is concerned, it is cramming, staying up the night before an exam and studying that is not very useful. A key sentence from the new science of learning: learning happens when students are cognitively deeply engaged while practicing. Point number 4, in order for learning to become sustainable, in order for students to remember language in their long-term memory, the learning needs to be done over several days, remember the importance of sleep. Number 5, practice testing and distributed practice are the 2 most efficient and effective study strategies. Point number 6, I spoke about a vision for a possible future of learning where students would be able to actually engage in practice testing, distributed testing, and learning activities at different levels with the help of a digital kind of system, an online system where correction would also be done online and would be available to the students immediately. This would offer every learner a personalized learning track. So I think it's a beautiful vision for the future of learning. Thanks for watching this.